So I've been looking at food security, but here I'm using the term food sovereignty for very specific reasons, which I'll go into later. And I've looked at nuclear security and water security issues. And I'm contextualizing all that in terms of modernity and the quest for modernity in India. So this is the section on food sovereignty and security. Even within my project of food security and sovereignty, this is really a very small piece of the pie because there are at least two food sovereignty, food security movements in India that I have looked at. This is the one that is on GMOs and therefore the BT title. And I'll explain to you what BT is. I'm sure many of you are aware of what it is. But there's a whole other side to it as well, which is on food distribution, and it's the right to food movement in India, which I'm not actually going into today, but if anyone's interested, I can certainly talk about the right to food movement in India, which has actually been absolutely quite powerful, and much more powerful than the anti-GM food movements. So that's kind of the larger context that I'm talking about. Now, clearly, of course, some might consider this a rather cheesy title, perhaps, because this is referring to Hamlet's now all too famous soliloquy, pondering the dilemma between life and death. But the reason I use it is because I think it reflects well the current global and Indian fault lines on the use of BT genes or Bacillus thuringiensis in genetically modified crops, and I'll explain what that means. While Hamlet, if analyzed simplistically, resolves his dilemma by convincing himself through argumentation and the logic of the desirability to be over not to be, neither argumentation nor scientific logic or evidence has enabled a similar shift in the entrenched global and Indian fault lines on the desirability of BT-injected GM crops. It may be tempting to tell the story of the fault lines in the GMO debates in terms of these Hamletian binaries, the pro and con side, each in their entrenched silos arguing that the decision to promote or not to promote BT-GMCs will lead to life or death. The reality is actually far more complex. Stakeholders concerned with food security and BT-GMCs in India, like elsewhere, come from a variety of different interests and from a variety of different epistemological, scientific, and policy positions. In addition, they represent the varied interests of the state, civil society, and capital in India. While it may also be tempting to categorize the state and civil society as homogeneous, entities pitted in this legendary battle against each other, with the state up there unconcerned about food security and with deep ties to corporate actors, and civil society members representing grassroots interest, the real story once again is far more complex. Neither state nor civil society interests are monolithic, and their interests and interactions are much more multidimensional and multi-layered than this epic battle analysis presents. This paper then, or this presentation, examines the role that the state, civil society, transnationals, and local capital plays in the struggle over BT-GMCs in India. However, my point of entry into the debate is not the conventional literature on social movements. Is not the conventional literature on social movements. Rather, I address the debate wanting to understand the use of hybrid spaces, such as the judiciary in contentious politics. So what I'm doing is I'm moving away from Hamletian binaries and from some of the very traditional social movements literature, which looks at political opportunity structures, framing, resource mobilization. There has some work that has already been done on this, particularly in terms of, and I'll demonstrate later, in terms of BT cotton, but this literature has not been applied to BT brinjal, which I'll talk about. So actually, a second part of my project actually does do it in terms of contentious politics, the traditional literature on contentious politics, but today I'm actually looking at hybrid spaces. There is another literature that looks at framing and diffusion, and this is about the politics of knowledge. There's a little bit of that in my presentation today, but again, I'm focusing on hybrid spaces in contentious politics, CP, this contentious politics literature, and in that I'm focusing on the judiciary. But before I move on to my presentation and sort of my findings, etc., I want to just sort of clarify for those of you who do not know, what are GMOs and BTs? GMOs are genetically modified organisms, and they are created through the use of recombinant DNA technology, that is by combining DNA molecules from different sources to create a new gene. The new gene then is transferred to an organism, and it creates a new to create new genetic characteristics in the organisms. And that organisms, of course, can be crops, but we've seen genetic modification in other non-crop organisms as well. In crops, for example, proponents of GMOs allege that through GMO grafting you can change the nutrition density of crops, you can increase the nutritional density. They suggest that this is one way of meeting poverty and hunger. They also suggest that this is one way of meeting and creating drought-resistant crops or insect-resistant crops. So that's, and I can, maybe we can talk a little more about it if you want. What is BT? BT is actually this bacillus. It's a bacteria, it's a naturally occurring bacteria that produces a crystal protein, which is very harmful, lethal, as I say, to insect larvae. This BT gene is isolated and it's introduced into crops. The plant then it is alleged that produces its own insecticide and pesticide, and therefore deals with the things that can actually damage plant productivity. The claim from proponents is that a BT plant is more hardy and more insect resistant. They also make a productivity claim. They suggest that it'll lead to greater production because you're dealing with insects, right? And you're preventing harm from insects to crop. The second is an environmental argument that they argue that it will actually cut down the use of pesticides and insecticides as well. Okay, so the GMOs and BT crops in India. The GMO and BT crops in India, actually I talk about two phases in the GMO and BT crops. Phase one, as you can see, is cotton, that is a GMO-produced cotton. It was a BT cotton, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And the second is BT brinjal, which all of you know as eggplant, right? It's also known as aubergine. So these were the first phase, and let me kind of move down a little bit here. Let's see. Phase 1 and 2, okay. Now, I do this as phase 1 and phase 2. The debates around the public release of BT cotton that were held in India in 2002 were revived again last year, and it was when I was on sabbatical, so I was very easily able to participate and to follow these debates, which were very, very contentious in many ways. The public release of BT cotton was in 2002 in India, and this BT cotton was developed by Monsanto and its Indian counterpart Mako, which is the Maharashtra, which is one of the states in India, hybrid seed company. And so Mako has been very, very instrumental and one of the central characters in this. Monsanto owns about 26% approximately of shares in Mako, but actually its influence is much greater than just the share story would tell us. The debates, as I said, were revived on BT brinjal in 2009, 2010, and in February of 2010, there was a moratorium that was placed on the release of BT brinjal. So the story of BT cotton and BT brinjal have been quite different in India. Where BT cotton was approved for release, it is used very heavily. In fact, almost 80 above 85% of farmers actually now are using, particularly in the Vidarbha region, which is where many of you may have heard of the farmer suicides, have used BT cotton. And I'll talk a little bit about why, so BT cotton was approved, but its introduction into food crops has been placed on hold right now. There is intense lobbying going on right now in India to actually lift that moratorium, but it has yet not happened, but it might anyway, we'll see. Let me just go over some of the kind of ways in which what the regulations are and what the rules are that the Indian state has developed to deal with the release of GMOs in India. And I start off, if you look at when I'm talking about rules 1989, RCGM, GEAC, these are some of the rules and the organizations that actually deal with this. So the rules of 1989 actually I just call it rules here, but it's the rules for the manufacture, use, import, export, and storage of hazardous microorganisms and genetically modified organisms or cells. And this was created in 1989. It was created under the Environment Protection Act of 1986 in India. Under these rules, persons or corporations have to obtain the permission of the GEAC, which is the genetic engineering, sorry, I was going to say genetically engineered committee, but genetic engineering approval committee, before they can release the GMO. Okay, so this is a committee that they have to get permission from. The other is the RCGM, and this is the Review Committee on Genetic Modification, and it is held in the Department of Biotechnology in the Ministry of Science as well. So there's the reason I put both of them down there, because the corporate bodies have actually used these two, instead of going to one, go to the other to sort of circumvent some of the rules around GMOs, okay? So although the Indian government only started receiving requests for the import and trials of GM crops in 1995 and did not actually approve the commercial release of BT cotton till 2002, the transgenic material, BT cotton developed by Monsanto and Mako, had actually already been released into the fields before that. And they had done this by seeking the approval of RCGM and not GEAC. So another way of circumventing the GEAC. But the GEAC itself is also not that, let's say, critical of GMOs. In fact, it has been used as an arm of Mako and of those who are proposing GMOs be used in food security, in creating more food security in India. And just one of the pointers to that is that the one-time co-chair of the GEAC, C.D. May, was a director of the International Service for the Acquisition of Agrobiotechnology Application, which is allegedly, according to GM Watch and other groups, is an alleged mouthpiece of the biotechnology industry. So the chair of the GEAC had these very, very strong ties. Okay. The 2003 Cartagena Protocol, also known as the Biosafety Protocol for the UN Convention on Biodiversity, to which India and numerous other countries are signatories, has provided a global protocol for the handling and transfers of GMOs. It recommends the minimization of risk, use of the precautionary principle, and efforts to evaluate risk assessment using transparent and sound scientific measures. India is a signatory to the Cartagena Protocol, and thus, when activists are actually challenging the government and the release of BT cotton, they actually refer back to the Cartagena Protocol constantly and say, if we are signatories, we need to follow that protocol, okay? As stated earlier, despite a hard-fought effort by civil society to halt the commercial release of BT cotton, India approved its release in March 2002.